Okay, and let me share my screen. Okay, so we left off at the top of page 112 in this Koran edition, and Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We're in the midst of a discussion about renting to a Gentile, and whether it's permitted to rent to a Gentile, like land, bathhouses, things like that. And in the midst of the discussion, we came across the Samaritans. So the Samaritans are people who behaved a little bit like Jews, have the almost the same Bible as we do, but don't subscribe to rabbinic authority. So there's a question. Clearly, they're not called Jews, but they're in this category. They're not Gentiles, but they're not Jews either. So what would it mean about doing business with a Gentile, especially when they might be using what they're renting on Shabbat or holidays? So that's where we left off, right here at the top of 112. The Gemara cites a similar discussion. It's taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, a person may not rent his field to a Samaritan since it's called by the name of the owner. And this Samaritan will perform work in it during the intermediate days of a festival, right? So you can't rent to a Gentile, your field to a Gentile, because business is going to be conducted and people are going to see, this Jew's field is being worked on the holiday, and that's not right. So the intermediate days of the festival would be the concern in this particular case. And there are certain kinds of work that you're allowed to do during the intermediate days of the festival, and other work that you shouldn't do if you don't have to. So the Samaritans might have a different sense about doing work on they have the same festival, but they might have a different idea about doing work on the intermediate days.
Jonah,
so, yes, Bess?
I have a question about selling to a Gentile, your field.
Yeah.
Do we not have a workaround or a loophole that allows a Jew to sell land to a Gentile during the
sabbatical year?
The Jubilee year?
Yes, we do. But that sell is in air quotes.
Oh, so this is not in air quotes.
So this is like for a business thing, right? This is really selling.
So when we're selling, we're not selling. Okay.
It's like when we sell our chametz, we're not really selling the chametz, right? So it's a workaround. This is real business.
No, but the point is that we are.
Yeah, right. So Michael's saying the point is we are really selling the chametz, but we are not really selling the chametz. So we are really selling it, but we're not really selling it.
But theoretically,
theoretically, the person, Luis, can have access to everybody's chametz during Passover, but he knows not to.
But he could say no to resell it. I mean,
he could say no to resell it, but he doesn't. So yes, so right,
keep his job.
Right. So in the Orthodox world, the selling of the chametz is seen as a more serious. I mean, it's not to say I don't see it as serious. It's serious enough that I say that we should do this, and it's been part of Jewish tradition for 2,000 years or 1,800 years, but it's meant to be a loophole. And so we might have different opinions about loopholes. And so the rabbinic opinion is if the loophole was able to be found, then it was intended to be found, and that it's okay to have a loophole within a system. But it begs a question that would probably take a long time to discuss about the philosophy of law and especially religious law, right? And so if religious law is supposed to inspire spirituality, how do loopholes inspire spirituality? Okay, so and that's a serious question. Loopholes could denigrate the whole system, cause people to laugh at the whole system, and defeat the whole purpose of the system itself. And other people could say, well, it depends on our attitude towards the system and our attitude about ensuring that that law is meant to be lived by. In other words, Jewish law is intended v'chai bahem. We're supposed to live by the law, not die by the law. And if a loophole enables more people to be able to observe Passover according to Jewish law, then by all means, the rabbi said, then do the loophole. If the loophole allows more farmers to be able to observe the sabbatical year, then by all means, do the loophole. So there are some who might not believe in the loophole, and like for Pesach, will actually budget the food in their pantry and make sure that anything chametz is all used up. And if it's not, they'll give it away before Passover so that they actually don't own chametz at all, and won't even bother going through the ruse of selling their chametz. So it all depends on our attitude towards this. But what we're talking about here in this section of the Gemara is actually renting your field without a sense it's for sabbatical year. It's just because you want to make a profit. Okay, so the Gemara infers it is prohibited to rent one's field to a Samaritan, but with regard to a Gentile, what is the halacha? Evidently, it is permitted, as we say that the Gentile sharecropper works for his tenancy and not for the Jewish owner. So in other words, you're renting your field out, but you're not intending for the person to work. You're not hiring a worker to work your field. You have a plot of land that you don't need to work. You have plenty of stuff coming from the other part of your land that you don't need the extra acre or whatever it is. So you're renting that, and then it has nothing to do with you anymore. And the person who's working it has nothing to do with you. They're not working your field. They're renting your field for themselves. Right. But the question is, how do other people who walk by know that the person working the field is not working for the Jew, but rather working for themselves? So the Gemara asks, if that is so in the case of a Samaritan as well, why not say that the sharecropper works for his tenancy? So sharecroppers, they're working for their tenancy, they're not working for you. So what difference does it make who you're renting to, a Gentile or a Samaritan? What's the difference between the two? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar does not accept the principle that a sharecropper works for his tenancy rather than as the Jew's employee. All right, so he doesn't buy into that. They are the Jews, they are still an employee, and therefore, he says would say that it's not okay. The Gemara asks, but if so, with regard to a Gentile, what's the reason that it's permitted to rent to him? The Gemara answers that we say to him that he may not perform labor on certain days, and he complies. Right? So you can tell a Gentile, I'm renting you this field. You can work it, but here are the list of days in the Jewish calendar that you can't work. Because you can't work the field because it's just not appropriate for it to look like I'm working the field. So then, if that's the case, then a Gentile will listen to a Jew and follow those rules. So the Gemara asks, if that's so, then in the case of a Samaritan as well, we can say to him that he may not perform labor on certain days and he will comply. The Gemara answers, a Samaritan will not comply, as he says, I am more learned than you, and I know that it's permitted to work on these days. So here is the sense of the rabbis, a bias that is coming out against Samaritans. So they're saying that Gentiles will listen to Jews and say, okay, I'll sign this rental agreement, which will say that I'm not allowed to work on certain days. But whereas they're saying that a Samaritan would say, who are you to tell me what days I can't work? I know that I'm allowed to work on Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of the festival. Who are you to tell me that I can't work on those days? So there's a little background here about, here's a picture of a Samaritan with a Torah scroll. A Samaritan will not comply. The Samaritans have their own version of the Torah, which they claim is the correct version. Since Samaritans rely on their own Torah and believe it to be correct, they will not listen to the Jew, but rather will claim that they have a better knowledge of the Torah and halacha than the Jew. So they have their own interpretation of the Torah. And like I said, their Bible, including the Torah, is a little bit different than ours. There is if you just Google Samaritan Bible, which might also be called the Peshitta, P-E-S-H-I-T-A, there could be many articles that will come up that highlight differences in text. And there are some places that in the Torah look like there's some words missing. And in the Samaritan Bible, they fill in the gaps so that those words aren't missing. Like, for example, Cain and Abel going out in the field. It seems like something was happening in the field, like some part of the story is missing from the text itself. And it's possible in the Samaritan Bible that they add a few words there to kind of explain why Cain is really upset with Abel in that story. So that's just the story part. There could be about halacha as well, that the Samaritans have a different interpretation based on their version of the Torah, which will make them pretty strident in their viewpoint and not willing to compromise when it comes to working on a field or not during the intermediate days. Okay?
Something else going.
What's that?
They're talking of the reason it's a problem is because they're talking about sharecropping.
Yes.
Sharecropping means you get a piece of whatever he produces, as opposed to simply renting, which is you pay me $1 sum,
right,
and you get everything.
Right.
So therefore, you're now removed, like in the bathhouse.
Yes. Right.
There's no sharecropping in the bathhouse example,
right,
because it's only an amount of money. But if he's sharecropping, you are to some extent. He is working for you because you get a piece of what he produces.
Right.
If you rented it to him, though, maybe this wouldn't be an issue.
Well, so that's the question. It's
I'm trying to find the word sharecrop
right. So the just a second. Where is that word sharecropper here? Arisa, I think.
And his bathhouse is its yiskor.
Right. So which is a right. So I'm not sure we need to get into the technicalities of the difference between rental and sharecropping. No, it's okay. And but for the rabbis, the idea is is twofold. Is your name still attached to the land when you are renting or sharecropping? And number two is, can you trust the Samaritan or a Gentile to follow the rules? Okay. So the Gemara asks, if that is so, that's you can't trust the Samaritans to comply with these rules because they know Jewish law better than Jews do. If that is so, why does Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar state specifically that the reason for the prohibition is because the field is called by the name of the owner? let him derive this halacha due to the fact that the Samaritan, like a Jew, is commanded to refrain from labor during the intermediate days of the festival. And since he will work on these days, renting him a field is included in the prohibition. You shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. Right, which so there's another layer there. If you're renting, then you might be leading the person on to think they can do whatever they want, whereas they should know better, and you can't be involved in any way in leading someone astray. Yes.
I thought you are allowed to work during the intermediate days of a festival.
Like I said, there's some kinds of work that is okay and some kind that is not.
Okay.
If it's not necessary to do the work, then you shouldn't be doing work on the intermediate days. So it's unclear if working the field is work that needs to be done or not during intermediate days of the festival. So that's a whole other question, and we'd have to look to a tractate called Beitzah, I think, that talks about work on Yontiv and intermediate days. Yes, Phil.
Just curious, with this discussion, obviously many of these things are historical and they go way back, and some things, in our modern society are a little different. This is actually something that, could still happen in our modern society. I'm curious if anybody on the line, or you or anybody, we're not in an agricultural area, but people may know. Do you know any Orthodox Jews? Certainly some Orthodox Jews are wealthy enough to have, maybe property that they might rent out. Do you know something about a practical application of this particular thing?
No, absolutely. That it comes up with sale of synagogue buildings. So when we sold our building on Lockwood Drive to come here to Olney, we sold it directly to a church. And the question is, if like the Orthodox synagogue Beth Shalom, when it was in DC, sold its building to an Ethiopian church. They did that through the use of an intermediary. So they technically they sold the building to an individual, and then that individual sold it to the church, because there is this idea that you're not supposed to ma'alin bakodesh ve'ein moridin. You raise something up in holiness, but you can't lower it down in holiness, which according to traditional Jewish law, selling a synagogue for use as a church is violating that precept, because it is lowering the holiness of the synagogue. Synagogues already at a holy level. To sell it to a church would be lowering the status of the building itself, and should not be done. So I did not require us to have a middleman to do that, because I think that whole concept that one religion is holier than another religion is not really appropriate today. And I did not require or didn't even bring up for discussion with the finance committee at the time in 2006 that we needed to find this middleman to sell to, who would then sell to that church. But that's one noted example of selling to a Gentile or not. Yes, Debbie, Jesse.
Thank you.
So what about renting space out in a synagogue to a non-Jewish?
Right. So
organization?
like leasing the bottom of our the bottom floor of our synagogue for a non-denominational preschool. So the idea there is, again, I think that it is pretty clear. Well, there will be signage, I would imagine, that would make it clear that there's a difference between the synagogue and this preschool that's going to be possibly on the bottom floor of the synagogue. So people wouldn't might be confused. Oh, maybe the preschool is real, even though it has this different name, it's really Sharei Tefillah. The people might be confused by that, but certainly it's not. So the question arises: do we require if that preschool, if they have a kitchen down there, to only be serving kosher food? So that question did come up, and that to me is not an issue. They are using that space, they are taking over that space, leasing that space, and they can do whatever they want in that space. And the only question that people have is when since it's non-denominational, I don't think we have to worry about this, but what about if there's going to be Christmas decorations up, because we're going to have an agreement with them that we could still use that space for our religious school on Sundays. So the question will be about how we're using that space, and then are we allowed to cover up any decorations that might be on the wall that would be not Jewish and would not be appropriate for our religious school. So we're not there in the negotiations yet. We still have to fix the permit to allow us to lease the downstairs to a preschool. But yeah, so I wouldn't be as strict about this as the Gemara seems to be, because I think we're living in a different age than the Gemara did, and our attitudes therefore are a little bit different. And I think it's also clear that with commercial property, that there is a clear demarcation of what is Sharei Tefillah property and what is not.
Or not in Israel either, or even closer.
Right. So you have more, Debbie? Yeah, go ahead.
So we were our 10-month-old grandson is in a music class at a conservative synagogue in New Jersey. And we went to the class on Friday, and it's run by an organization that's nationwide. It's not a Jewish organization, but it clearly states on the front door of the synagogue that the building is closed on Jewish holidays. So I was just curious, I mean, there's always, as we said,
right,
a way around.
Yes, I don't know. We haven't gotten there yet, but like on Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah this year is Saturday and Sunday, so that won't be an issue. But when Rosh Hashanah is during the week, and Yom Kippur is during the week, so yes, that we're going to have some kind of and already we had preliminary discussions with them about Jewish holidays and us needing the parking lot, and we don't necessarily need the downstairs space, but it's possible. Yes, so there are certain times. So on Fridays in the winter time, so when Shabbos starts at 4:00, are we going to require them to close at 4:00 when it's Shabbos? I don't see a need to do that, because for that, they're not taking up any of our space. We don't need to use that space. And we're not running that preschool. If we were running the preschool, then of course we would follow Jewish law, but we're not running the preschool. So, it's kind of like this gray area here. Certain things we might have to come to an agreement about closing on certain days, and other things might not be so important. Yeah. So, yeah, Phil.
I think it was Michael mentioned, I mean, I did hear in the discussion, but again, it's a lot of words about specific things in the land of Israel. And then I thought I heard Michael say, well, we're not in the land of Israel, not because these rules, and you mentioned about the selling of the show, they do apply outside the land of Israel, or they
yes. So mostly what the Gemara is talking, some part of the agriculture part here is unique to the land of Israel, because one isn't supposed to, as a Jew, the land of Israel is supposed to remain in Jewish hands. So by selling anything, it's selling the land to a non-Jew, then you're giving up the land of Israel, and that you're not supposed to do. So there's that element there, as opposed to outside of Israel, where there is a sense. Well, let me say it this way: there's a sense about land, that the land of Israel is in a different category as real estate than real estate outside of the land of Israel. There's a more sacred, spiritual, unique character to the real estate of the land of Israel than to any other part of the world. And so it's not, we are meant as Jews to have possession of the real estate of the land of Israel because God gave it to us. So it's not our right to sell it because we're not God. Only God can determine who's living in the land of Israel. Whereas outside of Israel, then real estate is real estate. Okay, so there's that's the difference in this conversation.
I follow that. Then the sharecropping discussion, or the use of the land that you have leased or rented on a Jewish holiday or that kind of thing, is that part does apply outside the land of Israel, or
so that yes, that would, because if a Jewish owned business is supposed to be closed on Shabbos and holidays, and so anything, if it looks like your business is open, you don't want it to look that way. Whereas if it's a sharecropping and the person is totally taking over your property, so it's their property, then people you don't have to worry about what people are thinking because you're doing it the right way. So people wouldn't learn that you're actually doing business on the holiday or Shabbat.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So, all right. So we finish this paragraph. The Gemara answers. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar states one reason and adds another. One reason is that of the prohibition, you shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. And furthermore, it's prohibited because the field is called by the name of the owner. So so the question remains still a question. Some people think it's still the name of the owner, whether it's sharecropping or whether it's tenancy or whether it's renting. And some people say, no, there could be a difference between those things. So on to the next. Yes, Bess.
Maybe I'm just dense. How is renting a field interfering with you shall not put a stumbling block before the blind? How is that putting a stumbling block before the blind?
Because of the Samaritans who shouldn't be working on the holiday, but they are.
That's a stumbling. Is that the best?
Because you are, by renting it, you're facilitating them being able to work on the holiday if they wanted to. And they're not supposed to, so you are somehow enabling them to violate the law.
Okay. I don't like it, but okay.
Yeah, okay. The Gemara relates that there were certain saffron growers who jointly owned a field in an arrangement according to which a Gentile took possession of the field and worked in it on Shabbat, and a Jew took possession of it on Sunday. They came before Rava to find out if they could divide their profits equally, and Rava permitted them to do so. Okay, so you have a Jew and a Gentile who are saffron growers who jointly own a field. Okay, and so on Shabbat the Gentile becomes the full owner, and on Sunday the Jew takes full ownership. Okay, and then otherwise the rest of the week they share. Ravina, and so Rava said, yeah, you're allowed to do it this way. Ravina raised an objection to the ruling of Rava from a Baraita. In the case of a Jew and a Gentile who received tenancy of a field in partnership, with the understanding that they were to work the field and receive part of its produce in exchange, The Jew may not say to the Gentile, take your portion of the profit for your work on Shabbat, and I'll take my portion for my work on one of the days of the rest of the week. The reason one may not do so is that it turns out that when the Gentile worked on Shabbat, he was laboring partly on behalf of his Jewish partner. But if they initially stipulated when they entered into their partnership that the Gentile would receive a share of the profit in exchange for his work on Shabbat, and the Jew would receive a share for the work that he performs during one of the days of the week, it is permitted. So you have to make the arrangement ahead of time, not after the fact. Okay? Right. Okay. So, and if they did not make this stipulation, and later came to calculate the number of weekdays for which the Jew should receive the profit, corresponding to the number of Shabbatot that the Gentile worked, it is prohibited, as this would mean that when the Gentile worked on Shabbat, he was working on behalf of the Jew. Rava was embarrassed that he had ruled incorrectly. Ultimately, the matter was revealed that the saffron growers had stipulated from the outset that this was the arrangement, and therefore, even according to the Baraita, Rava had ruled correctly. So it matters when Jew and Gentile enter into an agreement before they start work. So if they do it after the fact, it's no good. You have to do it before the fact. Okay? Rav Gaviha from Bei Katil said that the incident was actually as follows. The Jew and the Gentile formed a partnership with regard to those orla saplings to tend to them and sell them. Okay, orla is a fruit tree, the fruit of a tree for the first 3 years that it's producing. We as Jews are not allowed to consume that fruit. Okay, it's a question as to whether it applies to the land of Israel or throughout the world, but that's the idea. The first 3 years of the tree producing fruit in the life of the tree, those first 3 years are prohibited for consumption. Okay, why? Because the Torah says so. So here's orla, the background. It is prohibited to eat or derive benefit from the fruit that grows during the first 3 years after a tree has been planted. See Leviticus 19. This prohibition applies only to the fruit, but not to the other parts of the tree. In addition, the prohibition does not apply to trees planted as a fence for property or as a wind buffer rather than for their fruit. So a fruit tree planted for its fruit, you're not allowed to eat it. But a fruit tree planted to be a windscreen or a fence and then happens to produce fruit, you're allowed to. So here's another way that the rabbis are like playing with the system. So you didn't plant the tree in order to put it in your orchard, but you put it in order to make a fence or a wind barrier. If it happens to bear fruit, look at that. My wind barrier is bearing fruit. I'm allowed to eat from it. But if it's in your orchard, you're not allowed to eat from it. Okay, so so the Jew and the Gentile formed a partnership with regard to those orla saplings to tend to them and to sell them. The Gentile would work and profit from them during the orla years, the first 3 years after the tree is planted, when it's prohibited for a Jew to eat its fruit. And the Jew would work and profit from them during the years where the fruit is permitted. They came before Rava, who permitted them to do so. Okay, so instead of them being saffron growers, Rav Gaviha says the story is, no, it's about orla sapling growers. The Gemara asks, but didn't Ravina object to the ruling issued by Rava? The Gemara answers, no, Ravina's intention was to provide a support for the ruling of Rava. The Gemara asks, but wasn't Rava embarrassed by Ravina's statement? The Gemara answers, that never happened. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If the partners did not specify that the Gentile would work on Shabbat and the Jew during the week, but they also did not calculate their profits so that they would split the earnings equally, what is the halacha? The Gemara attempts to provide an answer from the Baraita. Come in here. If they initially stipulated that the Gentile would receive a share of the profit in exchange for his work on Shabbat, while the Jew would receive a share for the work on one of the other days of the week, it is permitted. This indicates that without specification, it is prohibited. So you have to be specific. If you're not specific ahead of time, then you can't reach this agreement with a Gentile. The Gemara rejects this proof. Say the last clause, if they came to calculate their profits, it is prohibited. This indicates that without specification, doing so is permitted. The Gemara concludes, rather, no, inference is to be learned from this baraita, as the inferences contradict each other. And this ends the chapter. Chapter 1. Okay, so let's, there's a summary here of chapter 1. So let's see, because we've been doing this for a long time, let's read the summary. Conducting business with Gentiles is prohibited on the 3 days preceding their pagan festival, as well as on the day of the festival itself. The Gemara concludes that prohibition against conducting business before the festival applies only in Eretz Yisrael. In addition to the prohibition against conducting business, it's also prohibited to borrow money, lend money, or repay a debt on these days, unless the Jew will thereby suffer financial loss, or if not doing so, will cause hatred of Jews. It's not only prohibited to conduct business on the days of pagan festivals, but one also may not do so at fairs held in honor of idol worship. This is because proceeds from the fair are used to support idol worship, and furthermore, the Jew would be profiting from money that's associated with idol worship. Therefore, if a Jew does conduct business at one of these events, he is not permitted to derive benefit from the money. The Gemara explains that a Jew must refrain from participating in events held in honor of idolatry, even if they are only social events. It's therefore prohibited to travel and enter a city where such an event is taking place. Similarly, a Jew may not give or accept gifts from a Gentile on the day of his festival, unless there's a concern that one's refusal will result in hatred. The Mishnah lists various pagan festivals to which this prohibition applies. These include festivals that are clearly pagan in nature, as well as royal festivals that include elements of pagan rituals and rites. There's a whole question about the coronation yesterday of King Charles III. Is that considered a pagan ritual or not? And the fact that that King Charles insisted that other faiths be included in the ceremony, like in the presentation of gifts, I think that they, like the chief rabbi of the British Empire, participated in the service. There's a Hindu who participated, a Sikh who participated, right? Like the Prime Minister of England is a Hindu, right? So he participated, not just because he's a Prime Minister, but because he's a Hindu. Just the whole idea of participating in this. And there's a whole other thing about whether Jews are allowed to be in a church or not, right? Orthodox Jews usually don't walk into a church, and the coronation occurred in Westminster Abbey. So how could the chief rabbi of England, who's an Orthodox rabbi, walk into a church? And the answer is because the Orthodox establishment in England said if the king commands your presence, then king or queen commands your presence in church, you have to go. Okay, so this whole idea then, the Gemara explains that a Jew must refrain from participating in events held in honor of idolatry, even if they are only social events, right? So I guess the other part of this is, was it idolatry? So, you could argue, you can make an argument that it it's walking a very fine line, because somehow there's a divinity ascribed to King Charles in that ceremony. Right? Because he's consecrated with holy oil, and right, and there was a whole thing in Times of Israel about that, because that holy oil was specifically brought from Jerusalem. It was made in Jerusalem. It was olive trees from Jerusalem. It was made in Bethlehem, I think the article said, mixed with some spices, cinnamon, and other things, and delivered it was supervised by the Anglican Church representatives in Israel, and then delivered for the ceremony yesterday. So what? Kosher oil. That's right. With the certification of the Anglican bishop in Israel.
But no animals were harmed.
Right, no animals harmed in the production of that oil. But there's a whole question about, and that chief rabbi, right? The King Charles put him up in King Charles's house, which was 15-minute walk from Westminster Abbey, so that he could attend. And the president of Israel and his wife, I think, also stayed there, and there was kosher food for them as well for Shabbat. And the ceremony all started at 6 o'clock in the morning our time. So that was 11 o'clock in the morning then. It was something, or noon. So the chief rabbi had to daven early in order to be able to attend and participate in the service. But so you're not supposed to do it unless you do it, right? So yes, Jesse.
So I was a little startled to see the provision regarding Jewish practices that could inspire hatred of Jews. Now, there's no real appeasing the anti-Semite. We know that anti-Semites will be anti-Semites no matter what Jews do to try to appease them.
Right.
Yet, I don't recall seeing in the course of our readings, the rabbi saying, well, let's carefully gauge the impact of these rulings on how Jews are perceived in the larger Gentile world. So,
right. Yeah. So I think that it was hidden there. You kind of had to, I think if we read the traditional commentaries, there might be some wording there and about this appeasement. So right. So what is this paragraph here? I'm looking at right. It says, similarly, a Jew may not give or accept gifts from a Gentile on the day of his festival unless there's a concern that one's refusal will result in hatred. So there could have been commentaries over the course of the Middle Ages that could have given examples of this, we refused the gift and then a pogrom started. So there could be that sense. So an important thing in understanding this tractate is understanding Jewish history and knowing what it was like to live as a Jew in various countries around the world. And for the past 1,000 years, that mainly means in Europe. Okay. And that the position of the Jew in Europe was precarious, to say the least, and if not dangerous. So you never knew what to do in order to be safe from the Gentile. Do you appease? Do you not appease? Right? And I just keep coming back to the play Leopoldstadt. And if you haven't seen it on Broadway, go see it, because it just depicts this one Jewish family and the different ways that they were trying to fit in to Austrian life.
As
right?
it happened yesterday on Broadway.
Okay, yeah. So, right, there's some who converted to Christianity. There are some who married Christians. There are some who believed in Herzl and thought that what he was beginning to say made sense. And others said, no, we are Austrian through and through. And then what happens to all of them? Right? I'm not giving it away. They die in the Holocaust. Okay, so no matter what you think the approach is supposed to be, you're wrong, because it's going to end up bad in the end. So the idea here that there's a concern that one's refusal will result in hatred. Okay, what is that hatred? And what's the level of hatred? will the hatred just stop with that one person who refuses to do business? Or will the hatred extend? Oh, that one didn't do business. That means all of them won't do business. I'm going to take out my revenge on all the Jews because this one didn't do it. You don't know. So though the Gemara didn't have that conversation, I think that's what we need to understand is happening in the background.
There's also kind of a naivete in that to think that anything the Jew does, pro or con, is going to allay Jewish hatred. We've learned through years of tragedy and history,
Right,
that it's impossible.
Right.
But they haven't learned that yet. You would
right. So they've experienced it already with the Romans.
Mhm.
And I think there's history with the Greeks. So in the rabbis' times, they have Greek and Roman history to deal with. And our time, we have Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Muslims, Catholic Church, Inquisition, Nazis, Poles, Cossacks, Russians. Right, so that's 10 right there from the little bit of history that I know. Okay, so there's a lot more to deal with it. Yeah, Michael has.
Could they also just be saying, look, if you don't have to stick your finger in someone's eye, don't do it?
Oh, right, but the other hand is you got to make a living.
Right. So in other words, if you don't have to.
But what if where you're living, there aren't that many Jews to make a living from?
Right.
And you have to make a living off of working with Gentiles.
Right. So if you have to work with these people, don't go out and unnecessarily make it difficult.
So right, but it depends. It's all in the context of, this is the ideal,
Who you are,
not to
where
do
you are.
business. But if you can't be in a situation where you can't do business, well, then here are the layers. I don't know what's going on here. Why did this come up on my screen? Why is that? Just a minute here.
That your access to look at your pages there, or do you have those?
There it is. Okay. For some reason, I got signed out of being on my Gmail. Okay.
Anti-Semitism.
That's it. Okay. Let's try to finish this summary. The Gemara explains that a Jew must refrain from participating in events held in honor of idolatry. Okay. The Mishnah lists various pagan festivals to which this prohibition applies. These include festivals that are clearly pagan in nature, as well as royal festivals that included elements of pagan rituals and rites. This chapter primarily addresses festivals held in the Roman Empire, but also mentions Babylonian and Persian festivals. In addition, it's established that in case of a festival of an individual or a festival that is conducted in a specific place, the prohibition against conducting business applies only to those celebrating the festival, and it applies only on the day of the festival itself. Throughout the year, it's prohibited to sell to Gentiles items that will be used for idol worship. Therefore, if an item is commonly used in idol worship, or if the Gentile states explicitly that his intention is to use an article or animal for that purpose, the sale is prohibited. In a case where the item is commonly used for idol worship, there are times when it's permitted to sell it. For example, if it's clear, either due to identity of the buyer or by virtue of the number of items sold, that will not be used for idol worship. The chapter further taught that it's prohibited for a Jew to build a structure that will be used for idol worship. Despite all the above, the accepted custom throughout the generations has been to permit business transactions with Gentiles even on their festival days. The reasons for this leniency, which can be traced back to the Gemara, include the fact that the Gentiles with whom the Jews come in contact are no longer pagans, a fear of instigating hatred against Jews, and the difficult situations in which the Jews find themselves, right? So there's no choice. No choice. In addition to the prohibition against selling items to Gentiles that will be used for idol worship, other sales are also prohibited for a variety of reasons. One may not sell large livestock to Gentiles, lest they use livestock that belongs to Jews to perform labor on Shabbat. The only manner in which it is permitted to sell large livestock to Gentiles is if the transaction is conducted through a middleman who buys the livestock from Jews and sells it to Gentiles. It's prohibited to build public structures for Gentiles that might lead to a public harm or that may endanger the lives of Jews. Similarly, it's prohibited to sell weapons or dangerous beasts to Gentiles in case they are deployed against Jews. This prohibition is dependent on the circumstances, as it's permitted to sell weapons to Gentiles in locations where they protect Jewish residents. Conversely, it's prohibited to sell weapons to Jews if there's reason to believe that those Jews will use them to harm the public.
I forgot.
Yes.
Who would the middleman be? They were pagans.
Don't know. I don't know, Bess. I don't know.
Okay.
Another category of prohibited sales to Gentiles applies only in Eretz Yisrael. This prohibition extends to all land and anything that is attached to the ground, provided that it has not been detached. The reason that one may not conduct these sales is because there is a prohibition against letting Gentiles acquire land in Eretz Yisrael. It's also prohibited to rent fields in Eretz Yisrael to Gentiles, as this serves to exclude the land from the mitzvot that apply in Eretz Yisrael. In Syria, which is of an intermediate halachic status that is a lesser level of sanctity than Eretz Yisrael, but greater than that of other lands, it is permitted to sell houses, but not fields to Gentiles. In any location, it's prohibited to rent a residence to Gentiles, lest he bring an idol into the residence. It's also prohibited to lease property to a Gentile if it will appear to other Jews that the Jew is violating a prohibition when they see the Gentile performing labor there on Shabbat. This chapter includes many agadic discussions, right? Homiletical midrashim, most of which deal with the future day of judgment and the relationship between the Jewish people and the nations of the world throughout the generations. These discussions also touch upon various historical events. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. We'll start chapter 2 next time. Just a note, we have 2 more sessions, and then we're done for this year of Talmud study, because there's Memorial Day, and then there are a couple Sundays in June also, the first 2 Sundays I'm not available to teach. So May 21st, 2 weeks from today, will be the last Talmud session for the year. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.
Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.